Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph, starting with Nun Daled Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara previously said when a person teaches Torah, he should repeat his teachings until the student knows it. Then the Gemara said, how do we know to the extent it should be fluent in his mouth? The Gemara brings the pasuk, V'lamda es b'nei Yisrael v'sima befihem, and place it in their mouths. Now the Gemara brings another explanation of this pasuk. Omar Rav Chizdo ein Torah niknes ela b'simonim. The Torah is only acquired with simonim, with mnemonics, symbols. Shenemar says, simin sima befihem, place it in their mouths. Al tikre sima ela simona. Don't read sima, place it, but rather simona. You shall make simonim in order to then acquire the Torah. Shama Rav Tachlifa min Ma'arov. Rav Tachlifa heard this drasha when he came from the west. Ozal Amro Kamei de Rabbi Abo. He came before Rabbi Abohu and explained, he said over this teaching, Omar, Rabbi Abo responded, Atun mehasam masninulo. You learned from this verse, Ano mehocha masninala. But we learned it from a different verse. What's the verse that we learned it from? Hatzivi lechosh tziyunim. Set up for yourselves signs. Simi loch, make it for yourselves. Osu tziyunim latar, make for yourselves signs, simonim of the Torah. Ask the Gemara, my mashma dahai tziyun lishna disimonu. How do you know tziyun is a lashon of simin? Says the Gemara, Dirshu ra etzem adam. We have another verse that says, and a person will see a bone of a human being, ubona eitzloi tziyun, and he will then erect something that will be a tziyun, a simin next to this bone. Rabbi Eliezer Omar Mehacha. Rabbi Eliezer said from this pasuk, a different verse, we learn out that you need to make simonim in order to then acquire Torah. Omu emor lechachma achoy siat. Tell wisdom, referring to the Torah, that you are my sister. Umoida lebina tikra. And you shall call understanding bina a relative. Moida is a relative. Asay moidaim la Torah. Make signs, simonim, for the Torah. Rav Amar, another drasha from this verse, Asay moyadim la Torah. Make appointed times to learn the Torah. The Gemara goes on to say, on Nun Hey Amud Aleph at the very top, let's use Rashi to introduce. Says Rashi, V'hainu da'omar Rabbi Avdimi. Hod amoron ditzorich litroyach ulahamid simonim ulaharim betachbulois. And in order a person to then acquire wisdom when he learns the Torah, then he has to make simonim and he has to be toreach. He has to then be toreach to make those simonim. Says Rashi, Hainu de Rabbi Avdimi, the mefaresh diyuka dekro she'im bashamayim hi tzorich ato la'alois achara. This is what Rav Dimi is going to teach us, that a person has to be toreach after being koine the Torah, including making simonim. Says the Gemara, V'hainu da'omar Rav Avdimi bar achamo bar doiso. My dirsiv was meant by the following verse, Lo bashamayim hi, v'lo me'ever layam hi. That the Torah is not in the shamayim, and it's not across the sea. Lo bashamayim hi, he explains, she'im bashamayim hi, ata tzorich lahalois achareo. It's not in the shamayim, but if it would be in the shamayim, you'd have to go after it. Now that it's in the Oretz, so you have to be Toreach here in the Oretz. If it was on the other side of the sea, then you'd have to then Toreach to get to the Torah on the other side of the sea. Now that it's here on this side of the sea where you're present, so you have to then be Toreach to then acquire it. Aidei the simonim. Rava Amar, Rava said, Loi bashomaimi. Another drasha of lo bashomaimi. Lo timotze b'mi shemagbia daitoi aleh kashomaim. The Torah will not be found by a person who's raising his das like the Shamayim. In other words, he says that I don't need to have teachers to teach me Torah. that person is not going to have then Torah to be found within him. He will not be able to acquire Torah in the proper way. Similarly, a person who says that my mind is expansive as the Yam, I also don't need to then review my learning. Such a person again will not acquire Torah properly. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Loi Bashamayim, another drash of Lo Bashamayim, Loi Timtza Begasei Ruach, is not going to be found by a person who is arrogant. V'loi me'ever layamhi, lo timotze loi basachronim v'loi betagorim, is not going to be found by those who are traveling to do business back and forth, and those who are peddlers within the city also, because the Torah needs to be acquired through then a person who's constantly learning it, and therefore he has to be found inside in the Beis HaMedrash. The Gemara now returns to our Mishnah. The subject of our Mishnah is when you have different configurations of our city, how do you go ahead and define the borders so that you can count 2,000 amos for its tchum? Says the Brisa, Tonu Rabbanon, Ketad Ma'abrin Ha'orim. How do we then extend the area of the city, depending on its configuration, to then determine its borders? Aruka Kemoshe. If it is long, you mean to say is rectangular shaped, you leave it the way it is. Agula, if it is circular, oisin la zovius, you make a square around the circle, and then you count the 2,000 amos from the square. Mirubas, if it is already a square configuration of the city, ein oisin la zovius, you don't make corners. The Gemara will have to explain, if it's square, then it already has corners. What does it mean to say in the Brisa, then ein oisin la zovius? We, of course, will not make zovius. What's the havamina? The Brisa continues, Haisa rechava mitzad echod v'ktsar mitzad acher. If it is wide on one side and is narrow on the other side. In other words, you have a northern side that is very wide on the northern side, but on the opposite parallel side, the southern side, it is very short, very narrow. So what do? Says the Brisa, Roin oiso ki'ilu hi shove. We view it as if it's the same. In other words, we view the southern side to be parallel to the northern side. And just like the northern side is quite wide, we say that we extend the southern side to also being wide as the southern, as the northern side, and then we square it off. Take a look at Rashi, parallel to where we were reading over here in the Gemara. Dibra maschil, haisa rechava mitzad zeh v'ktsar mitzad zeh, roin asa ki'ilu hi shalva. Says Rashi, kisheba limdod hatchumim lemarov. When you want to go ahead and measure the western side, the western border, Eitzel Keren Ma'aravis Droimis, by the southwestern corner, Eino Moided Minachoime, you do not begin measuring from the wall. In other words, if you measure from the wall, it will be much less than where you would go ahead and where we want to measure from. Rather, what you want to do is you want to extend the border all the way to the northwestern corner. That will go all the way to the western border and then count the 2,000 amos from there. Similarly, when it comes to the southeastern corner, take a look at the diagram where Rashi makes a diagram to illustrate this point. If you go to the diagram, the middle, of course, is the ear, the city. But you see on the left-hand side is the northern border, which is much wider. On the right-hand side, the southern border is much more narrow. So instead of then going to where the land, where the wall would then end on the western side, down below on the bottom of the diagram, rather, what you do is then you extend the northern border to the southern border, and you square it off. So then you count the 2,000 amos from the squared off area. So too, when it comes to the southeastern corner, you'll do the same thing. You'll square it off and measure the 2,000 amos from there. Back into the Gemara, the Brisa continues and says, Haya bayis echad yotzei kemin pigum or shnei batim yotzin kemin shnei pigumim. If you have in the city that has rows of houses, but one house jets out, protrudes, or you have two houses that protrude, the Brisa says, Roin oisan ki'ilu chut matuach alehen umoide mimenu lahalon alpaim amma. We view it as if there is a string that is taut, that is pulled on top of them, and then we count the 2,000 amos. In other words, if you have the row of houses and you have one house that is protruding out, you use the outer protruding house to make the border. Haisa asui kemin keshes or kemin gam. If the configuration of the city is such that it's an arch, that means all the houses are in the shape of an arch, or kemin gam, which is a backwards reish, then roin oisa ki'ilu hi malaya batim v'chatzeros umoide mimenu lalan alpaim amma. Then we take all of the open area that is, let's say, in the inner part of the arch where there's no houses, and we close it. We close the arch, or we close the gam and square the gam off, whereby when we count the border, we count 2,000 amos from the squared off area. Now the Gemara analyzes the brisa that we just quoted. Omar mar aruka, if it is long, we said that it's a rectangular shape. Kemoishehi, then we leave it the way it is. Ask the Gemara pshita. Why would we then do something different? Explains the Gemara, Lotzricha da arika v'ketina. It's long on one side and it's short on the other side, making a rectangle. Mahu desema, what might you have thought to say? Litein la putya aorka. I might think that I should make it into a square. I'll square it off. Kamash malon, we leave it as a rectangle. Mirubas, when it is a square, that's the configuration of this city. The Brisa said, Ein oisin lazovius, you don't make corners. Frek the Gemara pshita. Of course you don't make corners, it's already cornered. Says the Gemara, Lotzricha. It's true, it's corners, it has a square, but the square itself is not going north, south, east, and west. Rather, it's like a diamond shaped. And therefore, you might think to say, I might think to then square it in so that it'll be squared on a north, south, east, west type of square. Kamash malon, we leave it the way it is squared. The Brisa said, Hayabayis echad yoytze kemim pigum. If you have one house that protrudes from the other houses, or shnei batim yoytzin kemishnei pigumim, or you have two houses that protrude from the other houses, then what you do is then you make the border from the protruding houses. Ask the Gemara, Hashta bayis echad amris. If you already extend the border from the outer protruding house, so then certainly if you have two houses that are protruding, then certainly you're going to then extend the border. What is the chiddush? Why do you need to mention two houses? Says the Gemara, we're not talking about that the two houses are on the same side. Mishtei ruchos, one house is on one direction, on one side, and another house on another side. Let's say on north, and the other house is on east, or another north and south. I might think I only go ahead and extend the border on one side, but on two sides not. Kamashman, even if we have one house on the north side protruding and one house on the south side protruding, we'll still extend the borders both on the northern side as well as on the southern side, and then we'll count 2,000 amos from those borders.